They had crossed an ocean as prisoners of war, carrying with them months of hunger, rationing, and strict control. They expected their captivity to begin with orders, discipline, and carefully measured portions. They were prepared for punishment, not comfort, and certainly not choice. But on their first morning in an American camp, something quietly disrupted every expectation they had brought with them. Food was placed on the table without comment, without limits, and without explanation. No one shouted, no one counted portions, and no one told them when to stop. For men who had learned to measure survival in crumbs and rules, this moment did not feel like relief. It felt like a mistake. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. The journey to the United States had already stripped away most certainties. Captured far from home, transported across borders, and finally placed aboard ships bound for an unknown destination. These German prisoners arrived with little more than assumptions to guide them. They had no clear picture of what captivity in America would look like, but they carried expectations shaped by years of war, propaganda, and experience under strict military systems. When the camps finally came into view, there was no dramatic announcement and no defining moment that marked the beginning of captivity. Instead, there was quiet. Barracks stood in orderly rows, surrounded by wide, open spaces rather than crowded city streets or shattered villages. The air felt different, calmer than many had imagined, and the absence of immediate shouting or violence unsettled them more than aggression would have. The men were directed toward their assigned areas with minimal instruction. There were guards present, but they did not rush the prisoners or push them forward. Movements were slow, deliberate, and strangely ordinary. For soldiers accustomed to constant tension and rigid control, this lack of urgency felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. Many of these prisoners had spent months, sometimes years, living under strict rationing before their capture. Food had been carefully measured, portions reduced again and again as resources dwindled. Meals were not moments of rest, but calculations, where every bite carried weight and uncertainty. Hunger had been constant, shaping daily routines and quiet thoughts alike. As they moved through the camp for the first time, the prisoners watched closely, searching for signs that confirmed what they believed captivity would bring. They expected harsh rules to be enforced immediately, routines announced without explanation, and mistakes punished swiftly. Instead, they found themselves waiting, standing in line, moving from one place to another without clear direction as to what would happen next. The barracks themselves were plain but functional, offering shelter without grandeur or threat. Wooden structures, evenly spaced, with interiors designed for use rather than display, became temporary homes without ceremony. There was no sense of comfort, but neither was there immediate deprivation. This balance, neither kind nor cruel, created unease rather than relief. As morning approached, the camp settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar to the men who observed it. Guards moved quietly between areas, performing their duties without raised voices or visible hostility. Conversations among prisoners were subdued, cautious, and filled with unspoken questions. No one wanted to be the first to misinterpret the rules of this new environment. For many, the greatest discomfort did not come from fear, but from uncertainty. They had prepared themselves mentally for suffering, for discipline enforced through punishment, and for survival measured in endurance. What they encountered instead was a space that did not immediately confirm those expectations. This uncertainty lingered as the prisoners were guided toward their first shared routine within the camp. There were no speeches, no warnings, and no explanations offered to prepare them. They were simply directed forward step by step, into an experience that would challenge not their physical endurance, but their understanding of what captivity was supposed to be. They did not yet realize it, but the absence of answers would become one of the most unsettling features of their time in America. And it was within this quiet, unanswered beginning that the first true disruption of their expectations was about to occur. The first meal did not arrive with ceremony or warning. There was no announcement, no explanation of rules, and no indication that this moment carried any special meaning. The prisoners were simply guided into a large room, arranged with long tables and benches, and instructed to sit. For men who had spent years associating food with scarcity, this setting alone felt unfamiliar. Meals during the war had rarely been quiet or routine. They were measured, monitored, and often accompanied by tension, as if the act of eating itself required permission. Here, however, the room filled slowly, without urgency, as prisoners took their places and waited. Food was placed on the tables in plain containers, without emphasis or comment. There was no counting of portions, no visible effort to limit what was being served. Bread appeared first, followed by plates and cups that were filled and then filled again. Coffee was poured without hesitation, and when cups emptied, they were quietly refilled. The men watched closely, uncertain whether this was a mistake or a test. Some hesitated before touching the food, their hands resting on the table as they waited for a signal that never came. Others began eating slowly, stopping often, watching the guards rather than their plates, expecting the routine to change at any moment. No one spoke loudly. The room remained calm, almost subdued, as if everyone present understood that something unusual was happening but could not yet name it. The guards moved between the tables without haste, observing without interference, their presence steady but unobtrusive. What unsettled the prisoners most was not the food itself, but the absence of limits. There was no instruction about how much was allowed, no reminder of rules, and no visible consequence for hesitation or excess. For men accustomed to restrictions that defined daily survival, this lack of structure created discomfort rather than relief. Some prisoners stopped eating altogether, pushing their plates aside as they waited for correction. Others continued carefully, taking small portions even when more was available, unsure whether restraint was expected. The act of eating became deliberate, cautious, and strangely exhausting, as each movement was weighed against the possibility of unseen consequences. The meal ended without incident. No one was reprimanded, no food was taken away abruptly, and no explanation followed. The prisoners were simply directed to stand and leave the room, carrying with them a sense of unease that lingered long after the tables were cleared. Outside, conversations remained quiet and fragmented. There were no clear conclusions drawn, only questions exchanged in low voices. Was this a single occurrence, a calculated gesture meant to confuse them, or a routine they had not yet learned to understand? For men trained to survive within rigid systems of control, the lack of clarity was deeply unsettling. They had learned how to endure hunger, how to follow strict rules, and how to anticipate punishment. What they had not learned was how to interpret generosity that came without explanation. As they returned to their barracks, the memory of the meal remained vivid, not because of its taste, but because of what it suggested. If food could be offered without restriction, then perhaps other assumptions about captivity would also prove unreliable. The day continued as if nothing unusual had occurred. Yet for many of the prisoners, that quiet meal marked the first moment they realized that life in the American camps would not follow the patterns they had prepared themselves to endure. The effects of that first meal did not appear immediately. There was no open discussion, no visible confrontation, and no collective reaction that could be easily recognized. Instead, the change revealed itself slowly, through small behaviors and subtle pauses that unfolded over the following hours and days. Inside the barracks, conversations became shorter and more cautious. Men spoke in low voices, often stopping mid-sentence, as if uncertain whether even their thoughts were safe to complete. Some sat on their bunks in silence, staring at the floor or the walls, replaying the moment again and again without finding an explanation that felt reliable. The absence of rules during the meal had created an unexpected tension. Prisoners who had learned to survive by anticipating limits now found themselves unsure of where those limits existed. Without clear boundaries, every action required judgment, and judgment carried risk. This uncertainty followed them into their routines, making even familiar movements feel deliberate and restrained. At the next meal, the room filled more slowly than before. Men took their seats with care, watching not only the guards but each other. Some mirrored the behavior they had observed the previous day, taking small portions and eating slowly, as if restraint itself offered protection. Others hesitated longer than before, waiting for someone else to act first. Again, nothing happened. No instructions were given, no corrections made, and no reactions demanded. The routine repeated itself with the same quiet consistency, reinforcing the confusion rather than resolving it. For many prisoners, the most unsettling realization was not that food was available, but that their usual methods of adaptation no longer applied. They had survived by understanding systems, by learning how power was enforced and how rules were punished. Here, the system felt incomplete, as if an essential part of the structure had been intentionally removed. This uncertainty extended beyond the dining hall. During work details and moments of rest, prisoners found themselves watching for signals that never came. Guards passed without comment. Schedules were followed, but without the sharp enforcement the men expected. The absence of immediate consequences made it difficult to predict what behavior was safe. Some prisoners responded by withdrawing. They spoke less, moved carefully, and avoided drawing attention to themselves. Others attempted to impose their own structure, clinging to habits formed long before their capture. They followed routines strictly, even when no one demanded it, as if discipline itself could restore a sense of order. The quiet reaction was not fear in the traditional sense. It was not panic or resistance. It was a persistent, low-level tension that came from being unable to interpret intent. Without punishment, without reward, and without explanation, the men were left to navigate an environment that did not behave as they had been taught it should. As days passed, this internal adjustment continued without resolution. Each repeated meal reinforced the same message without stating it openly. The absence of limits was not a mistake. It was a condition they would have to learn to live with. For prisoners trained to endure hardship through obedience, this silent challenge proved more difficult than hunger ever had. The question was no longer how much they could endure, but how they were supposed to behave when endurance was no longer being tested. The prisoners had been trained to read authority through action. In every system they had known before, power revealed itself through correction, punishment, and constant reminders of control. Guards were expected to intervene, to enforce limits, and to respond quickly to any hesitation or deviation. What unsettled them in the American camps was not the presence of guards, but their restraint. The guards were always visible. They stood near entrances, walked between areas, and observed routines from a distance that felt intentional rather than careless. They did not disappear, and they did not abandon their posts. Yet their presence lacked the urgency and hostility the prisoners had prepared themselves for. During meals, the guards moved slowly through the room, their expressions neutral, their attention steady but unobtrusive. They did not count portions or comment on behavior. They did not rush the men or signal when it was time to stop eating. The absence of intervention felt deliberate, as if restraint itself was part of the system. This behavior was difficult to interpret. In the prisoner's experience, authority rarely remained silent. Rules were reinforced through repetition and consequence. Here, however, silence seemed to replace instruction, and observation replaced punishment. The guards did not attempt to explain their role or the expectations of the camp. They did not offer reassurance, nor did they issue warnings. Their neutrality left the prisoners without reference points, forcing them to interpret intent without guidance. For many, this created a deeper unease than direct enforcement ever could. Without clear reactions from those in control, every action felt provisional. Eating too much, eating too little, speaking too freely, or remaining silent all carried the same uncertainty. Nothing was corrected, but nothing was confirmed either. Over time, the prisoners began to notice that the guards' behavior remained consistent. There were no sudden shifts in tone, no moments where restraint gave way to aggression. The guards followed routines with the same calm regularity, day after day, as if this quiet distance was not temporary, but permanent. This consistency challenged deeply ingrained assumptions. If authority could exist without constant enforcement, then the meaning of obedience itself became unclear. Many prisoners continued to follow rules strictly, even when those rules were no longer being actively imposed. Some men watched the guards closely, searching for subtle cues or hidden signals. A glance, a pause, or a shift in posture was examined for meaning. Yet the guards offered nothing that could be easily interpreted. Their behavior remained steady, controlled, and deliberately uneventful. The lack of visible punishment did not create comfort. Instead, it produced a quiet tension that lingered beneath daily routines. The prisoners were not being tested physically, but psychologically, as they attempted to adapt to an authority that did not behave as expected. As days passed, it became increasingly clear that this was not an accident or oversight. The guards' restraint was part of the structure of the camp. Control was maintained not through constant correction, but through the steady presence of rules that did not need to be spoken aloud. For men who had learned to define captivity through visible force, this form of authority was difficult to accept. It offered no clear enemy, no obvious resistance, and no familiar patterns to follow. Instead, it required adjustment, patience, and an ongoing effort to understand a system that refused to explain itself. By remaining silent, the guards forced the prisoners to confront a new reality. Captivity in this place was not enforced through fear alone. It was enforced through uncertainty, routine, and the quiet expectation that the men would regulate themselves. After the first meal, and after the quiet realization that nothing had gone wrong, time began to change its shape inside the camp. There was no clear moment when this shift occurred. It happened gradually, through repetition, as the same routines returned again and again without interruption. Morning followed morning in the same way. Men rose from their bunks, formed lines, and moved through the camp along familiar paths. Meals appeared at expected times, work details were assigned without urgency, and evenings settled quietly over the barracks. Nothing dramatic marked the passing of each day, and nothing signaled that the routine would suddenly change. For prisoners accustomed to living under constant pressure, this predictability felt unnatural. They had been trained to remain alert, to anticipate sudden shifts in rules, and to prepare for punishment that could arrive without warning. Here, however, the days unfolded with a steady rhythm that resisted disruption. The same food returned to the tables. The same guards took their positions. The same silence filled the spaces between actions. What had initially felt like an exception began to resemble a pattern. Some prisoners counted the days carefully, marking time in small, private ways. Others stopped counting altogether, allowing the routine to carry them forward without reference to the calendar. With each repeated cycle, the urgency they had brought with them slowly faded, replaced by a cautious acceptance of the present moment. Work details became familiar rather than threatening. Tasks were completed not under constant supervision, but through expectation alone. The absence of immediate enforcement remained, and with it came a subtle shift in behavior. Men followed routines not because they were forced to, but because the routine itself had become the structure of daily life. Meals no longer drew the same hesitation they once had. Hands moved more freely, conversations lasted slightly longer, and pauses became less tense. The food itself had not changed, but the reaction to it had. What once felt like a mistake now felt like an established part of life inside the camp. The guards continued their quiet presence, unchanged and consistent. They neither tightened control nor loosened it further. Their steady behavior reinforced the sense that this system was not temporary and that no sudden reversal was waiting just beyond view. As weeks passed, the repetition of days began to dull the sharp edge of uncertainty. The men adjusted, not through understanding, but through familiarity. They learned what would happen next, not because it was explained to them, but because it had already happened before. This adjustment did not bring comfort in the traditional sense. It brought something quieter and more complex, a sense that time itself had slowed, stretching days into a continuous present where anticipation lost its urgency. For many prisoners, this was the most profound change of all. Captivity was no longer defined by fear of the next moment. It was defined by the absence of disruption, by days that repeated themselves without demand or explanation. In this environment, survival no longer depended on endurance alone. It depended on adaptation to a life where nothing dramatic happened, and where meaning was not imposed by force, but shaped quietly through routine. By the time the men realized how deeply this repetition had altered their expectations, the routine was already firmly in place. The camp no longer felt like an unknown system to be deciphered. It had become a predictable world of its own, governed not by sudden punishment, but by the steady passage of uneventful days. For many of the men held in these camps, captivity in America did not begin with violence or visible suffering. It began quietly, in ordinary moments that did not match anything they had prepared themselves to endure. There were no chains, no shouted orders, and no dramatic confrontations to mark the transition into imprisonment. Instead, there were routines, meals that arrived without restriction, guards who observed without intervening, days that repeated themselves without sudden change. What unsettled these prisoners was not the absence of hardship, but the absence of explanation. They had been trained to survive through endurance and obedience, to measure danger through punishment and reward. Here, those familiar signals were missing, replaced by a system that demanded adjustment without offering clarity. Over time, this quiet structure reshaped their understanding of captivity. The lack of immediate control forced them to regulate themselves, to follow routines not because they were enforced, but because they had become expected. The prison did not rely on constant force. It relied on time, repetition, and uncertainty. For some, this environment softened the edges of fear. For others, it created a deeper, more persistent tension. But for all of them, it marked a turning point that would linger long after their release. The first morning and the quiet meal that followed became more than an isolated moment. It became the beginning of a captivity defined not by chains or punishment, but by a question that remained unanswered. In a place where nothing dramatic happened, everything changed. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.